author Joplin James Sell brings you the journey of Little Star, winner of the International Impact Book Award in Historical Fiction. Read for you by Doug Sanders. Prologue, where the stars begin and the mountains end. Before the world tried to change him, Tarak, called Kojonii, Little Star, belonged to the mountain. He belonged to the hush of the early wind, the sharp scent of pinyon pine, and the soft ochre earth warmed by the breath of Sha'indi'in, the sun. High in the lands of the Mescalero Apache, where the horizon brushed the sacred ridges of Cisnagini, Sierra Blanca, the White Mountain, 6-year-old Tarak awoke before the birds, before even the coyotes gave up their night song. It was as if the land summoned him. To the outside world, Cisnagini was a peak, cold, impassive, a thing to be conquered or named. But to Tarak it was not just land. It was Lisnaake, the place of breathing ancestors, a spirit, a teacher, the place where Yusun, the giver of life, had formed the bones of his people and whispered breath into their lungs. The mountain was sacred, alive with pulse, memory, and meaning. It held the footprints of white-painted woman, Isanaklesh, first mother of the Inde, whose laughter once filled the canyons and whose sorrow seeded the rivers. Her strength and wisdom still pulsed through every gust of wind, every stone warmed by the sun, every shadow stretched by dusk. Each morning Tarak stepped barefoot onto the earth, his small feet pressing into the cool soil. He would stretch his arms to the sky and whisper a greeting taught by his grandfather. Da'initlichko, shiya ahate, Cisnagini gojo nanina. In the blue dawn you are beautiful, White Mountain. Let me walk in beauty. His grandfather, Karuk Kassador, Bear Chief, walked beside him through the world. Karuk was Ende Shiyasi, my grandfather. But he was more than blood. He was a keeper of the old ways, a warrior of memory, a speaker of songs too old for paper. With silvered braids bound in rawhide and hands cracked like river stones, Karuk moved through the land as if every branch knew his name. They lived in a small lodge of pine and brush, built at the base of the mountain in a crescent hollow between towering rock faces and thickets of chamiso and bear grass. A stream trickled nearby, fed by snowmelt and shaded by cottonwood and aspen. At night, owls perched on the rafters. During the day, lizards sunned themselves near the hearthstones. Karuk never hurried. He moved at the rhythm of the land, steady, deliberate, aware. "You must listen with more than your ears, Shiatsi," he would say, kneeling beside Tarak to touch a cluster of bear tracks half hidden by wind-blown sand. "The wind speaks, the river remembers. The stars, they are our guides." Karuk taught him through showing, not lecturing. They followed mountain lion paths through thick underbrush. They crouched near water to watch the herons feed. When it rained, they stood still and let the water run over their faces, palms turned skyward. Each day began with ceremony, not a formal rite, but a way of being. Karuk would face the east and offer tobacco, murmuring, "Yusun da'i, nahia igi'i, shiehi doho, shikei, shiketa'i, bana'ani'i." Giver of life, these are my relatives. I stand with them. Guide us. Tarak would mimic him, lips stumbling over the words, but heart wide open. At dusk, when the air cooled and long shadows stretched across the land, the valley would fall quiet, as if it paused to listen. The crackle of juniper wood in the hearth became the heartbeat of their evenings. Karuk's voice, deep and steady, shaped tales from smoke and firelight. "In the beginning," he would murmur, eyes reflecting the flames, "Isanaklesh walked across the land and made it fertile. She sang to the mountains, danced with the rain, and gave birth to the people from her own blood. We are her children, born not to conquer, but to protect." Tarak listened with his whole being. He sat curled beside his grandfather, knees drawn to his chest, eyes wide, mouth still. The stories weren't just entertainment. They were maps, blueprints, memories stitched into flesh. He learned that the land was not just Keva, earth. It was Shikei, family. That the cottonwood trees were sisters, the hawk a messenger, the rock a resting ancestor. That spirits danced on moonlit ridges and that dreams could walk by your side in daylight if your heart stayed open. Sometimes they would wake before dawn and hike into the canyons where the light first kissed the stones. Karuk would kneel, place his palm flat on the ground, and close his eyes. "Shikei do o shidaina e, niheya igii," he'd whisper. "These are our relatives, our people." Tarak would mimic him, small brown hands pressed beside his grandfather's. He didn't understand the full meaning of the words yet, but he felt something pass between them and the land. A quiet knowing, a connection older than memory. He learned to read the signs around him, the twisted claw marks of a bear scratched into bark, the hush that fell over the trees before a storm, the way a rabbit froze just before danger came. Every moment in the wild was a lesson, every silence a prayer. "Hojo Tarak," Karuk would say, "to walk in beauty, that is your path. Never forget it." But beyond the ridgelines, far across the open plains, the world was changing. The old ones whispered of Balaga'ana, white men, who brought papers, rules, and things they called treaties. They promised schools and food, but took land and children instead. The Balaga'ana built fences around spirits, cities where trees used to pray, and roads that carved open the bellies of sacred canyons. Tarak began to hear words in the night: boarding school, English, uniforms, punishment. Words that felt sharp and wrong, like thorns beneath the skin. "What is boarding school?" he once asked. Karuk's face went still. He stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "A place where they try to make us forget." "Forget what?" Karuk turned to him, eyes full of storm. "Who we are." One morning, while gathering pitch pine to make torch sap, they came upon an old woman singing near the stream. Her name was Shina, and she had once been taken as a girl. Her voice, though cracked with age, still carried a note of defiance. "They shaved my head," she told Tarak softly. "Burned my skirt, beat me when I spoke Apache. But they could not take the mountain out of me, or the dreams." She smiled, then grew quiet. "Don't let them take your dreams, Kojoni'i." Tarak held the memory like a stone in his pocket. Warm, heavy. That night, as the coyotes sang beyond the arroyo and the fire burned low, Tarak leaned against his grandfather's knee. "What if they come for me in Deshiasi? What if they make me forget?" he whispered. Karuk looked at him long and hard. Then gently he lifted a coal from the fire, letting its orange glow reflect in the boy's eyes. "You are Apache, Ende. They may take your body, little star, but not your fire, not your name. Shikishtayana, your ancestors walk behind you. They do not forget, and neither must you." He reached into a small buckskin pouch that hung from his belt. From it he drew a slender necklace of leather cord. Hanging from the center was a small carved wolf head, shaped from desert juniper wood. Its eyes were etched with tiny pits, its ears pointed and alert. The carving bore no paint, only the clean whorls of grain and the soft gleam of oil-rubbed wood. Karuk held it between his palms for a moment before lifting it to Tarak's neck. "This is Ma'itzel, the mountain wolf. I carved it when you were born, from the tree that grows above the high spring where the eagles bathe. The wolf is fierce, loyal, and never forgets his way home, even when the trail is buried in snow." He tied it gently around the boy's neck, the wolf resting just below his collarbone. "When the winds change, hold your ground," Karuk said, "and if they ever try to make you speak their god's name instead of your own, remember this: Isanaklesh Chishiigi. The spirit woman hears you, even in silence. You are never alone." Tarak curled his hand around the wooden pendant, feeling its smooth edges, its quiet strength. That night he lay awake long after the fire turned to ash. He pressed his ear to the ground and listened. Somewhere deep beneath him the earth hummed, low and steady, like the breath of the wolf itself. "I will remember," he whispered. "No matter what comes, I will be your little star." And high above, the stars shimmered, watchful, ancient, and bright. Part 1, 1928. Chapter 1. Green Chili Stew and Fry Bread. Small fingers slowly reached towards the Rocky Mountain juniper branch, being careful not to tremble too much. The young boy didn't want his 6-year-old inability to control his nerves to inadvertently cause the pine needles to abruptly rustle, thus possibly alerting the majestic mule deer that they were nearby. It was then that Tarak suddenly felt a large hand gently lay on his small shoulders. "Patience, little star," Grandfather's voice whispered in their native tongue into his ear. "Not just yet." Tarak watched as his grandfather carefully notched an arrow into the taut bowstring, silently lifted the weapon until it was level with the ground, and then with his muscular arms steadily pulled the arrow back, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their attack. With a twinkle in his eye, he nodded his head at the child, who conscientiously yet gently pushed down on the juniper branch, thus allowing a clear path for the arrow to fly by once his grandfather would release it. The noble mule deer proudly lifted the 9-point rack of antlers, a true testament to its middle age, and its black nostrils sniffed the air, almost as if he sensed the emanating danger before him. But since the hidden native pair were camouflaged by the natural shield of the timbers, and once it seemed as if there was nothing to fear, the mighty stag lowered his head and began grazing again on the sweet mountain grass blades. Suddenly Tarak heard the whiz of the shaft zoom past him, and almost instantaneously the surprised animal cried out as the razor-sharp arrow drove deeply into its grand chest, immediately puncturing a lung. The stag stumbled forward, wanting to bolt away from his surprise ambush, but the debilitating pain from the first arrow was met with a second, and then a third, within seconds of each other, and the trapped animal could only collapse onto the rocky mountain path, which was now soaked red with its flowing blood. Grandfather Bear Chief emerged from the bramble of pine branches and reverently stridden towards the wounded beast, who was struggling on the ground with its labored breath. and Little Star quickly moved his tiny legs as he obediently followed behind the elder's footsteps, carrying his grandfather's hunting satchel. He already knew what he needed to do, since he had come with his grandfather on many hunting excursions since the time when the lad had been only 4 years old. Now he was almost 6 years old, and it had become second nature to him what needed to be done. He handed Bear Chief, who was already kneeling over the slain deer, the heavy hunting knife from the bag, and solemnly watched as the elder used the sharp instrument to sever the neck artery of the beast, thus officially releasing its soul from its massive body. "Thank you, my brother," Karuk said respectfully, and then he sliced into its abdomen and cut off a chunk of its liver. "Your gracious sacrifice will feed my family for weeks now." He turned and handed Little Star a small piece of the still warm organ. "Eat, my grandson, and thank your brother for his nourishment." Tarak obediently did as he was told, and put the flesh in his small mouth as the strong metallic flavor of the raw meat filled his taste buds. One day he would be given his own bow and arrow, which he knew Bear Chief would be responsible to make for him, since he was fatherless. But Little Star was still too young, and unfortunately he had to wait for a few more years. By the time he was 16 years old, though, he would be expected to be a skilled hunter if he was to take the test of manhood. For the test, the boy would have to go on a series of 4 raids with the men of his tribe. If the boy did well on these 4 raids, he would ultimately be thought to finally be worthy of being called a real man. This meant that he would be free to marry, hunt, and raid with the other men of his band. For now, Tarak was happy with still being just a boy, and even though he relished the quality time he got to spend assisting grandfather on these hunts, Little Star enjoyed that he could also play freely with his cousins and tribe mates, without the boring responsibility that reaching near adulthood status would one day bring to his life. No, for now, he truly loved the freedom he had as a 6-year-old child of the reservation. Shishinde, people of the mountain forests, or Meshkalende, people close to the mountains, were the official names given to the Mescalero Apache people. They were known as the Mescalero tribe by the Spanish immigrants and Mescalero Nahahinde, or people of the Mescal, by nearby Apache bands. The significance of the mescal agave cactus in their diet is attested to by both of the external references. The mescal agave was collected in the Chihuahua Desert south of the Sacramento Mountains by groups of 8 to 12 women. Together, men and women processed it and stored it so that it would last during the hard times when food was scarce. The Mescalero Apache Reservation, where Tarak and his grandfather Karuk lived, had been long recognized by Spanish, Mexican, and American treaties, and was formally created by an executive order of the President, Ulysses S. Grant, on May 29, 1873. At the time it was officially established as a reservation, there were only about 400 Mescalero on the nearly 463,000 acres of what had once been the heartland of their people's aboriginal homes. By the 1920 U.S. Census, that number had only risen to a still small number, 673 inhabitants. Despite this, Little Star had been brought up in the Apache way of life, which held the belief that there was both a dark and a bright aspect to everything. The Mescalero Apache experienced pain, suffering, and stagnation in the dark side of life, yet happiness, peace, and harmony could be found in the light of this world. Legends and ancestors' legacy established Mescalero identity, and Tarak had been taught that Apache spiritual ideas were to be transmitted poetically from one generation to the next. Oral history and tradition acted as an anchor to the past, a ballast that gave succeeding generations stability, direction, and fortitude. According to the conventional wisdom taught to him, Little Star had learned that the Creator was neither male nor female, and beyond human comprehension. The sun served as the physical embodiment, but the Creator was also present through the thunder, the wind, the mountains, and the rivers of the natural world. Given that the universe was created in only 4 days by the Creator, 4 was considered a very lucky number to the Mescalero Apache people. Sierra Blanca, or White Mountain as Turok's people had called it, Guadalupe Mountain, Three Sisters Mountain, and Oscura Mountain Peak were the 4 holiest mountains in the Mescalero Apache Reservation. The myth of a creator creating the Apache on White Mountain was part of a sacred Mescalero oral history. It was told that during a heavy downpour on White Mountain, the Apache heroine, White Painted Woman, gave birth to 2 sons, Child of Water and Killer of Enemies. The sons matured and exterminated the earthly creatures who preyed on humans. The foundation of traditional Apache religion was a faith in nature's power and the paranormal. For the Mescalero Apache, nature provided an explanation for everything in existence. Their people had inherited their virtues of a good life and longevity from the White Painted Woman. This was the driving force of their faith, what guided their very existence. After grandfather had prepared the deer for transport back to their home, Turok picked up their hunting supplies while Bear Chief hung the carcass across his very broad shoulders and carried it over the 3-mile mountainous forest terrain of the isolated reservation. He knew that they were very lucky because during the last few hunting expeditions they had only been able to catch a couple of rabbits and quail. Mule deer was almost out of season, and the elks wouldn't return to the reservation until midwinter. And with the sudden boom in population of the towns of Ruidoso, New Mexico to the north and Alamogordo to the west, grandfather had been afraid that the mule deer population might become more restricted if their migratory routes got further blocked by the ever-expanding cities of the pale-faced settlers. He had told Little Star before of the time when Karuk had been a teenager, just having reached manhood after passing the tests, when the white man had been able to erect a rail car line from the town of Alamogordo all the way up the Fresno Canyon to the small village of Cloudcroft in the heart of the Sacramento Mountain. The sounds of the new trains trudging up the steep climb had spooked the animal population so bad that it had taken nearly 2 years before the elk herds came back to the area. Luckily, life had returned to normal, and for over the last 20 years now, the animals were used to the sounds of the echoing hunting whistles of the white man trains that rang through the canyons multiple times a week. But Turok had his mind on other things now, for it had been a few months since they had last dined on deer meat, and Little Star couldn't wait until his mother made them green chili stew with fry bread, his absolute favorite meal of hers. His mouth watered thinking about them dipping the warm, flaky fry bread in the delicious and tangy broth of the deer meat stew, a recipe that had been passed down from his great-grandmother, to his grandmother, to his mom. And he used the back of his hand to wipe the drool that was now salivating from his thin lips. Unfortunately, his grandmother had passed away last summer during a smallpox outbreak that had plagued the entire reservation and taken out over 75 lives, including his grandmother, a few aunts and uncles, and a couple of his younger cousins. It had truly been a scary and devastating pandemic for the small tribe. The death of a family member had far-reaching consequences. No one, for example, would dwell in a house where a death had occurred. Furthermore, the Apache never addressed their deceased relatives by name, instead referring to them as that girl, that boy, that woman, or that man. The Apache were terrified of the dead and anything associated with them. As a result, they customarily buried the dead the same day they died, to avoid any interaction with them. When they used to be more nomadic, the Apache relocated from the graves as far as possible. The deceased's personal items and wiki-ups were burnt or destroyed. The family, on the other hand, relocated to a different location right away. Their migration couldn't be too far, and it may have been only to a nearby field. The major reason for doing so is to deceive the spirit. After moving to a new location, the family of the deceased would modify their haircuts to discourage the spirit from identifying them. Even if the dead were friends or family members, Apache Indians would never visit their graves. They believed that mentioning or simply thinking about the dead would summon their spirit. Furthermore, anyone who visited the cemetery was suspected of being a witch. The major reason they avoided the ghost was because they were terrified it would return and get revenge on them. Because of this, it was thought that if the deceased were not properly buried, they would return to punish the one who buried them. So, when Little Star realized they were passing by the burying field where his relatives were laid to rest, he quickly averted his eyes away from the sacred grounds, so as not to call their attention. The last thing he needed was for one of his deceased little cousins trying to torment him in his sleep. Tirok wondered, though, if his grandfather missed his grandmother, since the man never spoke of his feelings aloud, and, of course, because he refused to speak about the dead. She had been the matriarch of their family lineage, a force to be reckoned with, and since her death their lives had seemed so much more empty. Occasionally he would hear his mother cry at night, since they shared a small sleeping room together, and the sobbing words "Shema, Shema" would lull him into dreamland. But since his Sichu had died, it was like she no longer existed, and Little Star couldn't help but feel a twinge of longing for the woman whom he had loved for the first 5 short years of his young life before she had been taken away from their family. Their household had been in mourning since. "Yadila!" Grandfather Karuk suddenly exclaimed when they rounded the place that led to their modest dwelling, and the native pair saw 5 horses tied outside their home. Right away the elder knew these equestrian visitors belonged to the tribal policeman, and a concerned look formed across Bear Chief's brow. "What do you suppose they want now?" he sighed, questioning the small lad as he dropped the mule deer's body over by the outside wooden preparation table that his daughter would soon use to cut up the carcass. "Don't say a word, Shiwowe. Let me do all the talking." As the pair slowly entered their home to greet these unexpected and unwanted guests, Little Star suddenly felt very afraid.